Hello and welcome to the panel discussion Unfolding Caste, the Dynamics of Casteism and Caste-Based Discrimination, hosted by South Asia Research Institute for Minorities. This is Sumbul Yusuf, Associate Project Director at SARIM. Thank you for joining us in today's discussion. As the world today grapples with increasing inequalities for South Asia and South Asian diaspora, caste inequalities and caste-based discrimination remains a daunting problem. The purpose of this panel discussion is to bring to light the issue of casteism in South Asia with a diverse panel that helps us understand different dynamics of the issue in the South Asian countries. It is quite clear that caste system has been resilient enough to survive across boundaries and religious identities and continues to create discriminatory environments for the so-called lower castes, both in home countries and in the diaspora. Casteism, however, manifests itself in different forms and degrees in each different country of the region. We are very pleased to have a panel from across the region to shed light on the dynamics of the issue in each country. And I'd say this would be a relatively unique forum for the discussion on caste, which presents a regional lens to the issue. We are very much looking forward towards learning from our distinguished panel on how casteism plays out, the factors that keep the status quo of casteism intact, and a way forward in anti-caste struggle. First and foremost, I'm very pleased to announce and introduce our moderator for today's discussion, Anubhav Singh. Anubhav is a Dalit activist and thinker based in Boston. He has studied at the Fletcher School of International Affairs at Tufts University and at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, where he focused on the political economy of South Asian and Middle Eastern countries. Earlier, he has worked with Professor Aisha Jalal on political economy, caste movements in India, on caste and Hindutva politics. His research interests includes political economy, colonialism, post-coloniality, political ecology, space, social movement, citizenship, South Asia, and South Asian diaspora. Thank you so much, Anubhav, for the time and effort you're putting in for the discussion. Let me now introduce to our wonderful panel. Our first panelist is Dr. Ajanta Subramanian. Dr. Ajanta is Professor of Anthropology and South Asian Studies and Mehra Family Professor of South Asian Studies at Harvard University. Her research interests include political economy, ecology, colonialism and post-coloniality, space, citizenship, South Asia, and the South Asian diaspora. Her first book, Shorelines, Space and Rights in South India, is about the struggles for resource rights by Catholic fishers on India's southwestern coast. Her second and more recent book, The Caste of Merit, Engineering Education in India, tracks the relationship between meritocracy and democracy in India to understand the production of merit as a form of caste property and its implication for democratic transformation. Thank you, Dr. Ajanta, for joining. Dr. Satish Deshpande is our next panelist. Dr. Satish is an acclaimed writer and author and is professor of sociology at Delhi School of Economics. His research interests include caste and class inequalities, contemporary social theory, politics and history of the social sciences, and South-South interactions. He is the author of Contemporary India, A Sociological View. He co-edited the book Untouchability in Rural India, and he is also co-author of a recent book, Sectarian Violence in India, Hindu-Muslim Conflict. Thank you, Dr. Satish, for sparing time for us. Next panelist is Dr. Thanges Paramsoti. Dr. Thanges received his PhD in anthropology and master's degree in refugee studies at the University of East London. He co-edited a book, Casteless or Caste Blind. He published peer-reviewed journal articles such as Caste within Sri Lankan Tamil diaspora and intercaste marriage in conflict settings. His research and interests include caste and class dynamics, the Tamil diaspora, conflict-induced migration, subaltern politics, religious transformation, and visual anthropology predominantly in Sri Lanka and Tamil diaspora localities. Thank you, Dr. Thanges, for joining. Our next panelist is Dr. Ghazal Asif. Dr. Ghazal Asif is Assistant Professor of Anthropology at Lumsden University. She received her doctorate from Johns Hopkins University. Dr. Ghazal is an anthropologist broadly interested in post-colonial regimes of legality and governance. domesticity, kinship, and sexuality, secularism, Hinduism, and Islam, and everyday life, memory, and identity in multi-religious and multi-ethnic societies. Thank you, Dr. Fazal Asif, for sparing time for us. Our next panelist is Arif Hussain. Arif is a community organizer and researcher based in Cambridge, Massachusetts, supporting anti-casteism and anti-racism work in the US. Arif also works with progressive groups in India who are at forefront of workers and farmers' struggle for a just and equitable society. A graduate of Harvard Kennedy School of Government with a concentration in democracy politics and institutions, Arif has more than a decade of experience of working with marginalized groups in rural areas of India. Last but not least, our panelist is Rachana Sonar. Rachana is a human rights activist, founder of IDEA Nepal, a non-profit organization working to end child marriage, violence against women and girls, and eradicate caste-based discrimination and poverty. Rachana has been struggling for effective implementation of laws to end caste-based discrimination. With an experience of being at the receiving end of caste-based discrimination, as she herself belongs to the Dalit community. Thank you, Rachana, for joining us. I'd also like to welcome and thank our audience who are listening online. Now let's start with our discussion. Over to you, Anubhav.
Good evening and hello everyone. I welcome all of you to this unique panel where we would be discussing the dynamics of caste and caste-based discrimination across South Asia, while also capturing how diverse this institution really is and how it varies from region to region, state to state, country to country. What the word caste really invokes, in my opinion, is the idea of privilege. And of late, it has emerged as a hotly contested site of protection of that privilege. So I'd like to start with the first question, and I'd like to begin with Professor Subramaniam here. To what extent has discourse around caste, or the very concept of caste, been successful in describing the oppression and inequality in a region as diverse as South Asia? What do we lose in subtlety and nuance if we do away with this framework? I think she's muted.
Okay, there we go. There we go. I was having trouble unmuting myself. Thank you. Thanks, Sambal, for the invitation to participate on this panel. As you say, it's unusually diverse in terms of the membership on the panel. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So, I mean, this is a huge question. I think one way to start an answer is just to point out that the only way to understand the dynamism of caste, right? The dynamism of caste, its transformations across time and across various contexts, is to see it as inextricably linked to broader economic and political dynamics, right? We can't understand its dynamism if we think of it purely as a religious or a ritual category, right? And I mean, one way to think about this is Shumit Guha, the historian who's written this marvelous synoptic account of caste that was titled Beyond Caste. I mean, he distinguishes between the field view and the book view of caste, right? And he says that the book view is one that would reduce caste to a kind of Hindu scriptural order based purely in purity and pollution, and that this doesn't really account for the prevalence of caste across religious affiliations, right, across religious boundaries, and the fact that social precedence or social ranking has never been just about purity and pollution. It's never been simply based in ritual status, right? Social precedents. I mean, caste has always operated as a means of establishing relative rank, right? What Ambedkar referred to as graded inequality, right? It's always been a kind of mechanism of producing and reproducing graded inequality, but the forms of status, right, that are claimed are not based purely in ritual, right? There are all sorts of other bases for establishing precedents, including, for instance, labor, right? What is the work that one does? So occupational specialization has been a really important basis for establishing rank. So I think we have to both attend to the fact that caste, regardless of context and regardless of time period, has been a mechanism for producing and reproducing inequality, right? But that the basis on which claims to status are made are remarkably variable. And also that across regions and across sub-regions, we have different configurations of caste, right? Which also has to do very much with its historicity, right? You don't have the same spectrum of caste groups in every region. So I think all of that complexity can only be captured if we think about caste as social, political, and economic, as well as religious, right? I mean, it's all of these things at once. And we have to be very careful not to reduce it to a purely scriptural, right, form of classification, which, I mean, if we think of it in that way, we're basically sort of adopting a kind of Brahminical view, right? We're sort of substituting a Brahminical view of social order for the actual social complexity of caste.
Thank you, Dr. Subramaniam. And I'd like Satish to come in here for this and present his remarks on this very question.
Right. Thank you. And like everyone else, I'm grateful to SARIM for this opportunity and to Sambul and to Anubhav for organizing the event in particular. To start with Anubhav's question and your observation that you felt caste was about privilege. I would amend that slightly to say that caste is fundamentally relational. As a concept and as a reality, it is relational. So it's more about a relational sense of privilege. So in that sense, it is fundamentally hierarchical and is always in reference to someone else. This word might not extend across the entire subcontinent, but at least the northern part of it, there is a word called aukat, which very well captures this idea. And a single person, a lone individual, cannot have aukat. Aukat is always in relation to others. Its status in relation to others. So caste is fundamentally of that kind. The second thing I would like to say is that caste is very much a phenomenon of today. It is not a survival of something old. In one sense, it is that, but we need not to think in those terms would be, I think, disadvantageous for us to understand what caste is like today. It's a very contemporary phenomenon, and it's a very adaptable phenomenon. And the whole point of it is to maintain a certain broad hierarchy and to maintain relative positioning of different social groups. So in this process, various kinds of ritual rules and scriptural ideas about purity and pollution have been completely set aside. On the other hand, the fundamental idea of I am better than you and so on, a graded inequality, as Ajanta was also saying, remains quite central and quite alive and well. So these are the things I would like to emphasize. Caste is not only Hindu, as Ajanta has already said. It is a subcontinental phenomenon. It is about mutual status or relative status. And it is a very adaptable and modern thing. We may be using the same name, caste, to refer to something that existed many centuries ago as well as it exists today. But today, caste is fundamentally about managing material status in relation to other groups. So it's about opportunity hoarding. It's about maintaining relative status, things like that. I'll stop here.
Thank you. Thank you, Satish. And I'd like to move to Ghazal first for this to get a different sort of perspective since we are talking about South Asia. Ghazal, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Again, I'd also just like to express my thanks to SARIM, the organization, and to Sumbul and Anubhav for organizing this. I just thank you, Ajanta and Satish, for your very insightful comments. I think I mostly agree with what they've said, and just to add to, one of the things that the question about caste that keeps coming up is its tenacity and its very slipperiness. And I think this idea that if we acknowledge that caste changes, regionally, it also has to change historically. Caste is not the same thing historically, as Professor Deshpande said. And I think once we start tackling that historicity, as opposed to seeing it as a, something from another time, it actually helps us grapple with what the stakes of caste emancipation or the stakes of moving beyond caste are, because it is an enormously slippery thing. And I say this from the perspective of Pakistan. My research is in Pakistan, where caste is very much everywhere you look, and yet it is officially not there, because when we reduce caste to saying that caste is something Hindu, then it would stand to reason that caste does not exist in Pakistan, and that is obviously not the case, right? And once we start tackling, well, what does caste look like in Pakistan, where it is not just a Hindu thing, where it is something more, and yet it is, even the state sees it as something that does not exist in Pakistan, then we can understand how tenacious and how slippery it is by looking at it as it changes regionally and historically through time. So I think that's what I would just add to the very, very insightful things Professor Subramaniam and Deshpande already said.
Thank you, Ghazal, for your comments. And I'd like to move to Rachna for your comments vis-a-vis caste in Nepal.
Thank you, Anubhav, for asking the questions. So today I am participating in this event not to talk about caste system and overall when it started and how it originated. I am here to tell my own experiences, like how it feels being a Dalit and how it feels being raised as a Dalit child in my community, as a Dalit student in my school, and as a Dalit worker in my workplace, as a colleagues. Like how it has affected of my well-being and how it could be different of my self-esteem, and how would I feel different if I wouldn't face this caste-based discrimination in Nepal. In Nepal, it started from the Khas Rajya, when Jaisthiti Malla has divided into 4 Varnas and 36 caste groups on the base of their works and their occupations, and it is how started being discriminated into different classicism of the caste, like upper caste, middle caste, and lower caste. And I belong to lower caste as a Dalit, so-called untouchable caste, which I feel totally injustice, and it's it's the violation of human rights, and nobody should be um, identified as an untouchable human in this 21st century. When we talk about human rights, and when we all are accessing the rights of technology, and when feels so sad to me that our community needs to know more about this caste system and how, as an individual, we can eliminate these harmful practices of caste-based discrimination. And is in Nepal, in our constitutional rights, it says that discriminating people on the basis of their caste, religions is punishable. But in real life, in our real society, every day it happens. It happens at home, at the community, at workplace, at school. And it doesn't happen so directly that you can um, go to police and you can um, you can file your for the discrimination. It happens so indirectly that you get the sense of discrimination. You feel like you are being treated differently. You are being like less valuable than the other people in the circle. But still you don't get that the direct proof for fighting your rights. um, so it has affected my well-being. And as a child, when I used to go to school, and I used to be very punished by my teachers just because of my caste, and even though my answer would be correct, but my teachers would cross on my paper, and they would throw my copies, and they would just like punish me so badly. Like physically they would give me more punish than other students. And even though I would come up with like brilliant ideas, um, but still I would be scolded, and I would be just like punished in the classroom. And that's how my childhood was. And when we were going to bring water from the community water taps, we were so-called untouchable, so we were not allowed to be in the queue and get the water, as we had to get first, even though we had to stay so last. When everybody finished so-called upper caste, then after I would get my privilege to get the water. And many times I would miss my school because I wouldn't come home early, waiting there for hours, and then I would get the privilege of abandon me from going to school. So these actual things still exist. And a few years back, 2 years back, in Nepal, West Rukum, there was a massacre just because one Dalit guy fell in love with a girl belonged to upper caste. And not only him, including his friends were killed by the whole village. They were like chasing them, throwing stones to them, and finally they had to jump to the river to rescue them. But unfortunately, they got drowned and they were killed. So it feels very unhuman behavior to me. And as a human, we get the equal rights to live in the society and to get the respect, whatever occupation we belong to. We have to get respect. We have to be safe, and safe space in our workplace and in school. And nobody has to face this just because of their caste. And we still have to raise our voice just to break this silence. And we all, working NGOs, INGOs, government, civil society, we have to work together to unite our common goal to provide the rights for Dalit people. And today I commit that I will give my time and effort, and I will talk about Dalit rights. and it has to be end, and everybody should live their life equally. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing your experience with us, Rashna. It definitely resonates with me, the kind of experience that you've shared. And I think more than any academic discourse, it is the lived reality of caste which actually tells us how essential a framework it is for studying South Asian society. And once again, thank you. I'd like to move to Dr. Param Soti here. Could you please share your view about the framework of caste and how important you feel it has been in your work and capturing its lived reality, the kind of inequities that you've experienced in your own society? Please go ahead.
Thanks for the organizers and the panelists. So I basically agree with all of the panelists, particularly Ajanda's understanding of caste, how the other factors, socio-economic material factors are playing a crucial role in ranking caste, rather than only looking at the religious aspect of caste, and also the Sadi's understanding on caste as a modern concept. These are very interesting argument. Talking about from my own experience and on my own fieldwork studies, I understand, particularly in Sri Lanka, coming from Tamil society, where the caste is a kind of silent subject. In Tamil we call it pesapurul. We don't talk about caste as you have that in India or Nepal. But we see how caste is important in every aspect of life. How it's evolving in everyday life, and when it comes to religion, when it comes to socio-economic development, and even during the conflict, how caste is playing a role, how segregation and the divisions is systematically, invisibly playing the role. That's a very important aspect that we have to look at when it comes to the caste. Is always not visible as such. The discrimination is not visible as such. It's always it's functioning in a kind of latent manner. What I understood that through my own experience, that a caste is a kind of individualism, individual factor. It's unbound rather than a system working in traditional society. So even though we call as so-called lower caste or oppressed caste, where we don't have a kind of institutional aspect of caste, as you have, say, for example, the Dalit movement. That we in Sri Lanka, we don't have a kind of movement which organizing all oppressed caste groups. Even oppressed caste group, they feel that they are individual group, always looking forward and going, mobilizing them to the upper ladder rather than keeping themselves as an organized group, identifying themselves as a group. I called it as an unbound reality rather than a bound system. So this is, I think, very, very important aspect to look at the caste in modern society. So I just want to add this aspect and understanding and agreeing with all other panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Paramsoti. And Arif, if you'd like to add in, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Anubhav, and thank you to Sumbul and SARIM for inviting us to the panel. Very interesting discussion so far. I mean, I don't think we should be raising this question again and again that is it limited to this religion or that religion, at least in South Asia. I mean, one very popular way a lot of people have done it is to just open the matrimonial page of any newspaper in any part of South Asia, actually. I mean, at least I have seen in India from Goa to Kashmir and from Bengal to Gujarat, any region, any language you will see, and you will see the prevalence of caste. And actually, we have data of I think more than 94% of marriages in India still take place not just within the same caste, but actually within the same subcaste. So and across religion, that cuts across religion. So that is one thing. And there is a I find it a little bit problematic by bringing the question of caste in the kind of domain of an organized religion, because it helps strengthen this binary I mean, at least in India, we can say binary, this Hindu identity and a Muslim identity. And of course, there are smaller minorities of Christians and Buddhists and other things like that, because somehow it makes it sound like that the religious identity is a more fundamental identity. And when I say religious identity, I mean a very organized religious identity, as we have seen in the subcontinent in barely 120 years, started in later 19th century, this whole project of having very strict religious identity as against a very fluid religious identity that has a long history in our past. Like, for example, even in India, I mean, I come from Bihar, and there's a significant Yadav population. So Yadavs are basically shepherding and rearing, cattle rearing population, and that trade is basically milk and other milk products. And then the Muslim equivalent, you can say, so-called Muslim equivalent, is Gaddis. So when I look at a Gaddi folk and Yadav folks, like almost 100% of their lifestyle is very, very similar. I mean, in the past few years, you will see more Gaddis having beards and stuff like that, which they did not used to have. I mean, some of them had, some of them, but that kind of as an identity marker that has come up. The point being that their occupation, the caste occupation, takes over their whole life, and we have this veneer of religion that, okay, the Yadavs call themselves Hindus and Gandhis have started calling themselves Muslims. So that has become something significant. So we need to be careful about that. And I think it also gels with what Dr. Subramanian talked about and referred to Guha's book, the field reality and the book reality. So this is the field reality, that if you look at people on the ground, and then it looks very similar. And also this classification in different castes, especially, I mean, not caste, but broader categories, is very fluid. Like you will see, so in northern Bihar, on the borders, we have a small tribal population. They come in scheduled castes. They're considered scheduled castes. But you cross the border into UP, and many of them considered scheduled tribes. Sorry, if they are in Bihar, they are called scheduled tribes. And when you cross the border, right, there is no line as such, but just in Uttar Pradesh, they will be scheduled caste. And there are many caste in many states who are called OBCs, and you cross over, they're somewhere scheduled caste. And then this kind of switch happens. So there is no such like strict boundaries. And I think as Dr. Deshpande was saying, that this is a contemporary, not contemporary, but a recent phenomenon, which is very true, actually, this kind of fixing. And just to end with, like, this also has grave political implications, like we are seeing in terms of like bringing caste into the realm of religion, and one particular religion. Like, for example, the whole project of Dalit Muslim unity, that, okay, somehow Dalit is one segment, and that is in a different religion, and Muslims are a complete different category without any caste system, and they can come together. We saw the experiment in parts of Maharashtra and some parts of Telangana. The problem is that when you say Dalit, you completely leave out the Arjals, which are the Muslim Dalits and Muslim tribals. And then you also try to mix oil and water, like Muslim being a religious identity and Dalit being a caste identity, and you're trying to bring it together, papering over all the differences within the Muslim community, or people who profess to be Muslims, and you try to bring them together. And of course, it's not going to work, and it actually helps the other side of the political spectrum by saying that, okay, these people, like 30% people are like, see, against us, and now we can bring the rest 70% into our fold, and that's the fight, and that's an unwinnable fight. So it has many implications, but my primary concern here is that in using the terms in this kind of debate, we reinforce the religious identity, the binary of religious identity, which actually does not help progressive. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Arif, for your insights about Bihar, India, and how caste functions and how it varies from region to region. And that really sets up us for our second question for this evening. Should caste then just be examined or looked at as a sort of a Hindu problem with a religious sanction or an Brahminical structure? Or should it really be examined, as Dr. Ambedkar said, as a system of graded inequality, where vertical mobility is constrained by its specific characteristics, like notions of purity and pollution, endogamy, hereditary? So how is it produced, reproduced, and reinforced in other religious and ethnic groups in South Asia? And I'd like to start with Arif first, and then we'll go around, so that Arif can share his experience.
Sorry, I think you broke up. Could you repeat the last part, please?
Yeah. So how is caste produced, reproduced, and reinforced in other religious and ethnic groups in South Asia? And I'd like to bring in your perspective with respect to the Muslim movement, the Pasmanda movement in India.
So I will give you just, I'll be quick and give you a short example, like the issue of minority institutions. I mean, look at AMU. A very prominent example is Aligarh Muslim University. I'm using the example of Aligarh Muslim University for various reasons. One also being that it is being one of the intellectual centers, I would say the major intellectual center of the Pakistan movement, which was based on creating this binary of Hindu and Muslim. So because Aligarh Muslim University has a minority status, constitutionally provided minority status, they don't adhere to affirmative action rules. I mean, the procedures and rules laid down by the Constitution. So what happens that when say, okay, we don't give, it's a minority institution, we don't give reservation to OBCs. But what happens that it's not just OBCs of other religions, but the biggest victims are the OBCs and the Arzals of Muslims themselves. And if you go to even Aligarh Muslim University today, and there are a few more institutions like that, and that perpetuates. And most of the Muslim kind of elite, I mean, I'm not saying most of the Muslim elite, the South is a little bit different. But in North India, if you talk about, because that was the institution started by Sayyid Ahmad Khan, and actually kind of a finishing school for the landlord, the landed Muslim elite of UP, I mean, at that time United Provinces. But that institution has become a very good mechanism of excluding Muslims of lower caste, and of course lower caste folks from other religions, as we are talking. And that goes on to that. Such a commission report is very clear on this, that overall Muslim representation is way disproportionate to their population. But if you just look at the Ashraf Muslim or the upper caste Muslim, they are way overrepresented. In terms of their population. I mean, not overrepresented, not at par with, say, Brahmins or those what we call the Savarnas. Definitely not, because a large segment of the upper caste Muslim elite migrated to Pakistan at the time of the partition. So that group lost it. But even then, compared to the rest of the Muslim population, they are way overrepresented. And that perpetuates. There's some reason, like we have data on the board membership of major Indian corporations, and we see that who are the people in board membership. That trend works, but at the same time, of course, not to the same extent as it happens with the Brahmins or the Banyas or the Kshatriyas, because of the sort of not just reduction in number, but reduction of power, which was caused by the partition of India, and a large segment of the Muslim upper caste landed gentry kind of chose to go to Pakistan. So that way. So through educational institutions, whatever businesses they control, their social status in places, through separate, I mean, there was a very little bit of story, but a heart-wrenching story from Bihar, which came out from the Darbhanga district, actually, that the the dome community, which basically the manual scavengers. So there are Muslim domes and there are Hindu domes and otherwise. So they had, of course, had a separate. They were Muslims nominally, and they had a separate graveyard. And of course, the upper caste had a separate graveyard in the village. And what happened that, and we know North Bihar is a very flood-prone area. So there was a time of flood, and the dome graveyard was flooded. And an 11-year-old girl died because of snake bite or something. And they wanted to bury her in the other side of the graveyard. And they paid a Gorkhan, another caste, which is the gravedigger caste, the Muslim gravediggers. And they had prepared the grave and everything. But then the other side resisted, and they were allowed to bury their girl there. And it's like, it's a very recent thing in the past few years. So there are various things through educational opportunities, land ownership, and wherever they have access to corporate roles and stuff, it perpetuates that way. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Arif. And I'd like to bring in Professor Subramaniam here for her work in South Asia, South India, with respect to Christians. Professor Subramaniam, can you please share in your thoughts?
Yeah. So, I mean, similarly to what Arif was saying and Ghazal was saying about the persistence of caste within Islam, I mean, you see that very much to be true within Indian Christianity as well, and you know, in part, this is because conversion to Christianity typically happened on a mass basis, right? People converted as castes, and so this was not the model of the individual convert, right? It was typically the model of the collective group conversion, and so and of course, the sort of irony is that often oppressed castes sought conversion as a means to escape the disabilities of caste stigma, right? But they carried caste with them into their new faith. So there's a sort of continuity of caste across conversion, right? Pre and post conversion, and this the reproduction of caste happens in all sorts of ways, right? Through endogamy, right? So there's very little marriage across caste boundaries, even among Christians, right? Even within the Christian community. In fact, I mean, if you look at the case of the Nadar community, for instance, in Tamil Nadu, there's more marriage between Hindu and Christian Nadars than there is between Christian Nadars and other Christians, right? So caste remains more of a sort of consistent basis of endogamy than faith, right? Than religious identity. And as Arif was saying, this is not just about marriage or occupational specialization. This is also, I mean, caste, it travels with you into death. So there are still caste-specific graveyards. So there's caste-specific churches, there are caste-specific graveyards. So it remains a sort of fundamental structuring principle of Indian Christianity. But when it comes to a sort of official designation, and this is also something that Arif pointed to, the presumption is that conversion out of, especially I'm talking just about Dalits now, that conversion to conversion out of Hinduism is an escape from the disabilities of untouchability. So Christian Dalits, Muslim Dalits are not classified as scheduled castes, right? They fall under the OBC category and not the SC category. So there's a sort of assumption that conversion brings certain benefits, right? Certain advantages that you wouldn't have within Hinduism, which have not been borne out, right? So I think in all of these ways, it's quite apparent that caste is not just a Hindu phenomenon. Right? There's one more thing I wanted to say, which is that which is about occupational specialization, and I think this is part of the slipperiness that Ghazal talked about. Is, you know, it's not the case that that castes have been occupationally static. You know, they haven't, right? And I think one interesting thing is that increasingly, so, you know, and this is also something that people who work on the pre-modern period have written about, that often a change of practice could lead to excommunication from caste, right? So if you took on practices that were deemed ritually impure or inappropriate for your caste, you could be excommunicated. Now that is almost, you'd be hard pressed to find instances of that today, right? So I think one has to also keep in view, this is part of the dynamism of caste, right? So if you take Brahmins, for instance, right? You know, there was a time when taking on something like tending to the body, right? Tending to bodily fluids would lead to excommunication. Now, that does not explain why there are so many Brahmin doctors today, right? Or even dealing with, you know, the technical forms of technical labor, which were seen as sort of less less honorable, right? Less honorable. You have tons of Brahmin engineers. So there's a kind of dynamism to the way, to the relationship, how to put it, caste and practice, right? When you think about occupational practice as the basis of caste, you don't see that there's been an increasing accommodation of a whole range of occupational practices within the same caste category. I mean, to a degree that was not the case before, right? So I think that's also important to keep in view.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Subramanian, for your comments. And this really sets up us for Ghazal's views on her work in Sindh about, you know, with respect to Dalits, Hindu Dalits in Sindh, and her experience with how caste functions there and in the state of Pakistan as well. Ghazal, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Anubhav. Yeah, I mean, your question is very timely because, you know, the question of whether caste is a Hindu phenomenon or not is something that's of immediate relevance and has been since 47 to the Pakistani state's understanding of how it is to deal with caste. Because logically, if caste is just a Hindu, or, you know, quote unquote, just a Hindu phenomenon, then the creation of Pakistan would mean that that is not a problem that the state of Pakistan needs to deal with, right? In a state set up to free everybody, ideally, from the yoke of Brahminical Hinduism, etc., whatever the founding principles. So that has not been borne out historically. And what, so, you know, this was something that Anubhav mentioned my work. So one of the things that I do show in my work is that right from the get-go, from 47 onwards, this was actively something that the Constituent Assembly in Pakistan struggled with, the Objectives Resolution, which is the founding document of the current constitution in Pakistan, says that we are, bound as a nation state to work for the upliftment of and they use, after a lot of fighting, they used the words backwards segments of society, and it was not clear whether that meant, whether that was specific to, are we talking about, caste here, or are we just talking generally about the poor in Pakistan? And that those aspects of how you are supposed to interpret that have been constantly, rehashed and hashed over again and again, up until 1971 and the liberation of Bangladesh and the preceding civil war. Until then, it was a very important question, especially in East Bengal, because East Bengal is where the majority of Dalit Pakistanis happen to live, where the Pakistani Scheduled Caste Federation had its headquarters. All of that. After the liberation of Bangladesh, what wound up happening was that West, what was then known as West Pakistan, that the way caste functions here is different, and yet there are Arif mentioned the way that caste is in many ways, it is a bureaucratic category, right? Who gets qualified as OBC in one province, who gets qualified as OBC in another place. OBC is not a category that exists in Pakistan. Scheduled caste is, right? So, and because scheduled caste, as we know, is a colonial category, it was introduced in 1935, which is why in Pakistan it still exists. OBC is a post-independence category. It does not exist in Pakistan. And so those whom the British qualified as scheduled caste are still scheduled caste in Pakistan. But people who were Dalit Muslims, Dalit Christians, whom the British did not qualify in those ways, fell through the cracks. And so in Pakistan, what are we supposed to do in a country that is supposedly ideally for Muslims? What are we supposed to do with Dalit Muslims, who do not fit into the schematics that have been inherited by the colonial state, and also do not fit into the ideological schematics of the new nation state? And one of the ways in which that question keeps recurring, just to return to the original question, is whether are we supposed to think of caste as a Hindu category in Pakistan? If yes, then there's a very simple, straightforward thing that we identify the Hindu Dalit, and that's a complicated question in Sindh because caste is fairly fluid and complex in Sindh. Or do we think about the existence of the clear existence and prevalence of casteism within Pakistani Muslims, casteism among Pakistani Christians, and what is to be done bureaucratically about that? And that's it's an aporia, I would say, for the state. I don't think they have an easy answer for it.
Thank you, Ghazal. And I'd like to bring in Satish in here. Satish, please go ahead.
Yes, in my personal opinion, the need to worry about caste as a phenomenon derives from its oppressive potential and its oppressive practice. And this is, to my mind, fundamentally social. There are different claims made about religious sanction and so on, where Hinduism is obviously in a special position. But we should not be confused by the fact that Hinduism as such, this thing called Hinduism, is today involved in a much larger power game to do with the largest country in the subcontinent, and not get confused by that when we are thinking about caste, because caste is primarily, the main reason we need to worry about it is because it is one of our most stable forms of maintenance of and reproduction of inequalities and potential for exploitation. So in this sense, I think it is a South Asian phenomenon, and there is really not much point trying to say whether it is more in X religion or less in Y religion and so on. Obviously, it takes different forms. But it's quite remarkable how even the occupational anomalies that Ajanta was mentioning, it's very consistent with status. Whatever is high status and high income, even if it is, putting your hands into other people's innards and intestines, which would have immediately been the most horrifying form of pollution, is appropriated and monopolized by Brahmins. So why? Because it's high status, and high status usually goes with high income. And if you look at it that way, it's extremely consistent.
Yeah.
You never say Brahmin surgeon, right? It's only the so-called the unexpected categories. You say Brahmin peon or a Brahmin sweeper will get an article in newspaper, whereas a lower caste sweeper is considered normal. So in that sense, I think it's primarily about the management of resources. It's about it's the transmission of privilege intergenerationally, resources intergenerationally. Despite all its myriad regional variations. So that would be my take, that focusing on religion when we are talking about caste is not particularly helpful.
Anubhav, I can just add like a small anecdote to what Dr. Deshpande said.
Please go ahead, Arif.
Sorry, just in terms of status, but also Dr. Deshpande, it's about money in the sense that my uncle in Jharkhand, my ancestral village is in now Jharkhand. He used to be a small-time trader of leather. So he will collect leather from nearby areas and raw leather and transport to Calcutta to a big guy who was a Marwadi. And the Marwadi has been in the leather business for various generations, many generations. And some people know that Marwadis are so kind of circumspect about vegetarianism, not eating meat. They don't even eat garlic and onion. And he was such an expert at leather, like just by touching, he can say. And my uncle used to always make fun of him that you are a Marwadi, you don't even eat garlic and onion, and you touch cow leather, like raw cow leather, and to check, my uncle was named Murtaja. Murtaja bhai, I don't touch leather, I touch money. That's what he always used to say. And he was a big guy, like a multi-million dollar man. Thank you.
Thank you, Arif, for that anecdote. Thank you very much. Dr. Paramsoti, can I bring you in, please, for your comments on this question and about your work within the Tamil community in Sri Lanka?
Yes, so I understand the other factors functioning in a kind of production and reproduction and a kind of reinforcement of caste. But when it comes to Tamil Sri Lankan society, where the religion is particularly playing a major role. At the same time, we can say other aspect of other socio-economic material factors. Particularly when it comes to Sri Lankan society, where they kind of recasting the caste, particularly when it comes to caste ranking. Particularly, Brian Pfaffenberger, who studied about Tamil society in 1980s, 70s and 80s, he is talking about Sutra agriculturalist domination in Sri Lanka, and particularly in Jaffna, where how they kind of recasting the classical caste ranking, how this Sutra became, Kaya caste rather than the Brahmin. That was the case in India. So how that possible? Because of the Vellalar agriculturists, they are fundamentally classified as a Sutra by building their own temples and bringing Brahmins to work their own temple as a servant. The kind of relationship between Brahmins and the Sutra is the Sutra become master and the Brahmins become their servant by working in the temple and getting salary from the Sudra. That kind of relationship is a reclassified, or kind of recasting and the entire caste concept of India. So that basically followed by all other caste group as well, particularly after during the prolonged armed conflict. It induced many people moved overseas in Western countries. It has created a kind of enforced structure of opportunities for all caste groups, particularly those so-called high caste, by using their socio-economic network. They initially moved affluent Western countries. Then the oppressed caste group also have migrated overseas countries. So after moving affluent countries, the oppressed caste somehow managed to build their own temples, right? Or building their own temple massively, building caste-marked symbols throughout the Jaffna Peninsula, utilizing their overseas remittances, rather than winning access to the so-called upper caste temples. This mobilization and the investment of oppressed caste in religious domain is not only reshaping the material development of religious places, but also support their effort to live with dignity, respect, and the greater autonomy in the religious domain. Just this very practice of rebuilding and renovating temples throughout the Jaffna Peninsula by different caste group leads to the reproduction of caste and consolidating caste-based identity. What is happening actually? Initially the oppressed caste group, they had their own temple, which is non-agamic. Initially they had the full ownership of the temple. They are the priest, at the same time they are the participants, the oppressed caste group. After building the temple massively in the agamic way of building temple, they bring the Brahmins to the temple and they ask the Brahmin to perform the rituals. So then they are away from the interior part of the temple and kind of bringing the religious aspect of caste relationship within the temple. So it's a kind of it's a visibly we can see they are building their own temple. Materially they are developed, their houses are built, and particularly when it comes to the religious domain, they kind of reproducing the caste system. It's not only done by the so-called upper caste Vallala, but also the oppressed caste group as well. It's a kind of reconstructing the identity by different caste groups by following the same the practice which has been followed by so-called upper caste historically. So that is the important aspect, how the reproduction happening. This is very factor. This is very true when it comes to the religious, other religion as well, Christianity. So the people converted from Hinduism to Christianity, so they also built their own church rather than winning access to the existing church. So again, all the churches in Sri Lanka, particularly in Jaffna, is belonging to different caste groups. So it's a religion is again a matter when it comes to the caste, how caste functioning in different religion, converting. So initially they had some issue of converting themselves from one caste group to another caste group, because there is an aspect of understanding that in order to overcome the caste, they may convert themselves into another religion, but that is not true. What they do, they kind of reproducing the same caste system by building their own church. It's a production and reproduction and changing and evolving, and one particular caste to becoming another caste. It's always happening in Jaffna, but that might be the case in other South Asian society as well, I believe. It's a religion is playing crucial role that we can't avoid that. But at the same time, we have to understand how other aspect of intercaste marriage, material development, economical status, educational status, also kind of overlooking this difference. in everyday life. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Paramsoti, for your comments. And I'd like to bring in Rachna in now. Rachna, can you please share your experience with respect to religion and caste in Nepal? Please go ahead.
Thank you, Anubhav. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you, Anubhav. And I would like to share a bit slide of Nepal, how the caste system is being constructed through the religion. As I said earlier, the whole casteism was divided into 4 varnas and 36 jat, which is caste. So somehow Dalit were those people whose occupation was to making pots, making shoes, or tailoring, or making jewelries, and also building the temples and doing arts and crafts and making statues and all the gods' figures. Although those people were so-called untouchable caste, like impure, untouchable. If Dalit people would touch Brahmin families, they would become impure and they had to go to the temple and, bathing for 3 times or 7 times just to make themselves pure again. When we look in the past time, like how our society has developed, the sense of caste discrimination by blindly following the religion. Like in him, even though in Ved there is not written that Dalits should be discriminated and Dalit people are impure and they are untouchable. It's not written like that, but some of the priest or religious leader, they took advantage of this Ved and they translated into their own for the benefit of their own. They would, convince to the society that Sudras, they are only meant to serve us. They are not equal to sit together us, and they have to show respect. They are always considered as the feet. So the feet has to be down, and they have to serve us. And they are in the ground, so we are high up than them, and we should not let them in our home. We should not eat and drink the things they touch. So this is how people have been perceiving about caste discrimination, and later on it is related about marriage, and like Dalits are not allowed to marry from upper caste, and then the whole social relationship is being disturbed because the religion in Hindu, in many temples, still in rural areas, Dalits are not allowed to go in the temple, because if they go in the temple, God will get mad, or it will be big scene, and the whole village or villagers have to sacrifice because of that Dalit people have entered in the temple. And this is so like out of sense for me, like how people still, like educated people, would believe in those things. I would have agreed if we go back in the century, like 19th or 18th, maybe it's possible because people were not educated. Maybe it's possible because people had no rights of speech or freedom of religion, because they were like only ruled by some regime or some cruel regime, and maybe it would be possible to believe and to be guided by the religion and to think like, yes, I am from Brahmin, that I should not let a Dalit come in my house because everybody will disqualify my caste status, or maybe I will even go downer caste. But now in 21st century, when all are educated and when people are talking about the caste rights and rights for people, and still when we go for remote areas and people are still blindly faithful, and they do discriminate Dalit people. So I had done a research and I was out in the field. I was asking people, why would you believe that you have to discriminate Dalit people. What would happen if you let them in your home? And very innocent woman, because I know they were just answering like what they have been told and what they have been, raised in their whole life. They would say, if I let Dalit people in my house, my family god will get mad, and my buffaloes and cows, they will climb in the tree and they will stop giving milk. So I don't want this to happen. So therefore, I stopped them for coming into my house. And there were like other answers which were so funny to me, and still like they believe, because I was not there to telling them like it is wrong. I was just there for the research. And somebody would say, if they sell their milk to Dalit families, and if the Dalit families like drink the milk, the suddenly the cows and buffaloes would stop milking, or they would not give any milk. Or the other answers were like, if they marry some Dalit people, their status will be lower, and all the other so-called upper caste people will discriminate them, and they have to, level down of their caste status, so they wouldn't dare. So there were like things, even like Dalit people would touch some plants, like fruits plants or some veggies plants. The plants would dry, or it would be, spoil or something. So which wouldn't make any sense, like why they would still believe in those spiritually misleading teaching practice of the religion. And I am not here to blame the Hinduism or Muslimism or Buddhism, because religion is the faith. The faith cannot be discriminate, or faith never discriminates people based on their caste or religion or status or color. It is because of our culture, I would say, like culturally how people are making our social phenomenon, and how we are sharing our relationship, and how we are forming the social norms and our rituals and our festivals. And all I can say is like it's our behavior practice, like what I have been heard, what I have been seen, and what I have been, taught from my parents, from my family, from the society, from everybody else in the community. And we try to believe on those things, and we say like, yes, it's the right things to do, and I have to make a distance. I should never marry a girl from the lower caste. And like one of my lecture, he's like really highly educated, and he was fell in love with a girl from lower caste, and he was so friendly and sharing with us, like even though I loved the girl so much, I couldn't convince my family, I couldn't convince my parents to marry that girl. So I am in big shock, like as a teacher, as a lecturer, if he's unable to convince his family, his parents, and to whom we expect to change this whole cycle, like even the highly educated professional people is struggling to change this, stereotype, then to whom we wait for? It's all about our behavioral practice, our cultural practice, and also religion is playing the role in between to discriminate people based on their caste.
Okay.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Rachna, for your comments. Ajanta, you had your hand up a while back. I'm sorry, I kind of missed that. Did you want to come in at some point during what Arif was saying, probably?
I don't. The point I actually wanted to make was just to reinforce what Satish said about, I suppose, making the distinction between labor segmentation and occupational specialization. So, it's not that people have maintained the same occupations across time, right? There's been lots of variation in what specific caste groups take on, by way of labor, but you still get labor segmentation, right, which favors upper castes right? So Satish talked about the appropriation of lower cost practices, right? Medicine, technical crafts, etc. That, through these forms of appropriation, you have upper caste taking on new forms of employment, but then engaging in precisely the same forms of opportunity hoarding, right? By trying to block other groups from entering those professions. So there's a way in which, these lower cost practices get appropriated, sanitized, accorded a new kind of status, and then hoarded, right? And just to go back to something that Rachna said, which I thought was really significant. There is something really, to the extent that caste is static and that caste boundaries have been maintained largely unchanged over time, I think it's the touchability line which has remained much more static than other forms of status, right? There's much more sort of variability and mobility within the sort of intermediate rungs of the caste hierarchy than there is at the very sort of top and bottom, right? So I think the touchability line is something that's really key. But having said that, when you look at hyper modern institutions like engineering colleges, right? Dalits are stigmatized not because they're seen as ritually impure, but because they're seen as intellectually inferior, right? So there is a new basis for stigmatization. It's no longer a kind of ritual basis. It's a different basis for stigmatization. It's not that stigmatization has gone away. It's not that Dalit kind of inferiority has gone away as a kind of foundational aspect of caste hierarchy, but the terms, the terms that are used, right, to refer to relative status. I mean, those change all the time, right? So I think that that's important, which is, you're seeing this playing out not just within South Asia, but in the diaspora as well, right? In institutions like the most well-known companies in the IT sector, whether it's Cisco or Google, right? You have this effort to, again, opportunity hoard, right? By not allowing forms of social mobility to groups that are seen as socially inferior, right? So you look at the IT sector, either within South Asia or in the diaspora, and the managerial tier is still overwhelmingly upper caste, right? So I think that we have to think both about occupational diversification and labor segmentation, right? That both are happening in tandem, and both are happening as mechanisms of reproducing caste-based social inequality.
Thank you, Ajanta. That's indeed a very important point, that occupational diversification and labor segmentation are together reproducing caste and reinforcing it in the modern world. Moving on, and I'd like to begin with Satish here. We know that social identities and categories are not unchangeable. The institution of caste and its perception has formed over a period of time through a complex interaction of government, that's both colonial and post-colonial government, that is policies, political machinations, and socio-economic developments. How has the institution of caste evolved in the post-colonial nation states in South Asia, particularly with respect to India and your work, vis-a-vis the state and its socio-economic policies? Have post-colonial nation states continued with the colonial policy of looking at caste through a religious lens to serve their own ends? And considering how caste and class in South Asia are kind of inextricably linked, can there really be social justice without economic justice? Please, Satish, go ahead.
Thank you, Anubhav. This is many different questions, I think,
Yes.
rolled into one. So let's try and sort them out. The effect of colonial policies, it is arguable, is still felt that there's a shadow of what the colonial governments did and so on, that we still feel today. But I think that is far overshadowed, that is far outstripped by the role, not so much the state as electoral politics has played. Electoral politics has had, at least in India, I can speak for India, I'm not sure the place of elections in the other countries of South Asia is, has been somewhat uneven and different. But in the Indian case, at least we can say that electoral politics has probably been among the single most important things to have changed the discourse on caste and even many forms of mobilization and practices around caste. There are obvious ways in which this has happened, and the 1990s in India have been a very big turning point for, interestingly, not only electorally, but also intellectually, in terms of the work that was done on caste. The rise of the OBCs to the national center stage during the 1990s marked a major turning point in thinking about caste as well. And there is plenty of evidence of it in terms of the kind of scholarship that has happened after the 1990s and the kind that has happened before. So that would be my take. Yes, colonial policies did matter. Yes, it's arguable that they continue to have a residual effect. But I think electoral politics and post-colonial politics is far more important. The other question you're asking about economic justice and social justice. We have a major sort of stumbling block in arguments regarding caste in India, where the economic level is seen as, in some sense, exhausting and having the capacity to erase caste differences or caste inequalities, which is simply not true. While on the one hand, it is true that in a broad sense, even though there has been sharp economic differentiation within every caste group, it still remains true that in India, and I think in large part for other South Asian countries as well, the top and bottom of the economic spectrum are still fairly identified in caste terms. The vast majority of those at the top of the economic pyramid are from the so-called upper castes, and the vast majority, a disproportionate majority of those at the bottom rungs are from the lower castes. This does not mean, however, that as the Nehruvian mentality, the Nehruvian mindset was that development and therefore in brief economic change will solve the problem of caste. Because within every class, we still find forms of caste discrimination. So, for example, within, let's say, the set of rich people, or within, say, IAS officers, within, as Ajanta's work shows, within people who have qualified to get into the IITs and so on, there is discrimination. So, for the economic to, the fungibility or the convertibility of one form of capital for it to be able to compensate for or add to other forms of capital. So the transferability of economic versus social capital in caste terms, this is a very tricky thing. It doesn't really work that way, and caste has a distinctiveness of its own, which is why the standard argument that why not abolish reservations based on caste and replace it with just an economic way of discovering who are the most needy is simply not true. I mean, it does not address the problem. So what I'm trying to say is that, yes, money matters, wealth matters, but for it to matter, for it to be able to erase caste disadvantages, you have to look into specifics. It's not an across the board argument. the degree of difference in wealth and the particular context, both the regional context as well as the particular caste context would have to be taken into account before we can say that economics will solve, economic development will solve the caste problem. It won't. History has shown that it has not.
Thank you, Satish. Just one more point that I'd like you to elucidate. India's neoliberal trajectory after the 1990s, how has that shaped the institution of caste and caste politics? Has it strengthened it further, or has it weakened it? Has it entrenched it more?
Yes, that's a very interesting question. Many progressive thinkers and activists at the very beginning of the period of liberalization in India, people like, I'm thinking now, people like Gail Ombet, believed that liberalization would be good for the lower castes. In the same way that perhaps colonialism is in many ways seen as being good for Dalits in particular. This argument has been made that because it is an overweening power, colonialism is an overweening power over a long established caste structure of power. It disrupts that caste structure of power and therefore provides opportunities to the lower caste that would not be available within a settled and very sedimented caste structure. So a similar analogical argument was being made about neoliberalism, that neoliberalism would shake up the market and by extension Indian society and bring new opportunity because the market is supposed to be caste blind. But this is what we have learned. The market is not caste blind because the market is embedded in society. Like everything else, it is embedded in society. So we have had a remarkable, the so-called private sector, the market sector in India is perhaps the most resilient in terms of maintaining and reproducing caste differences. So neoliberalism has only served to, I think, make more rigid caste divisions and enable the maintenance of caste hierarchies even more than what the state was obliged to by its own laws, despite the fact that the laws are most often remain on paper and their implementation leaves a lot to be desired. The fact that we had a so-called caste-blind constitution made the public sector to some extent, to a minimal extent, responsive. But neoliberalism has taken away the rights of labor and introduced precarity across the board. And precarity has been, to no one's surprise, been handed out in caste terms. So the most precarious jobs are the lowest castes, and the least precarious jobs are the highest caste, by and large. There are always exceptions, but by and large, that's the case.
And on that note, I cannot help but ask, how does that play into the Hindutva politics?
Into
Hindutva politics. Sorry, how does that play into Hindutva politics? How does that play to the advantage of Hindutva politics in India?
Yes, that is actually a very, in the cliched terms, that's the burning question today. What we are witnessing today is a near hegemonic. I mean, in recent times, the ideology of Hindutva has never been as close to achieving hegemony in the Gramscian sense. That is to win over the dominant common, to occupy the dominant common sense of a society where overt coercion is relegated to the background. And there appears to be at least a consensual agreement on a particular ideological framework. That's what, roughly speaking, what we mean when we talk about hegemony, and that is almost in place. And the centerpiece of that, given the nature of Hindu society, is the ability of the ideology of Hindutva to suggest to the lower castes that they now have under this new ideology, that they have the possibility of a new future, provided they join in the campaign against Muslims and to some extent Christians. In a sense, the lower castes are being invited. I'm putting this crudely, but it helps to keep things short. The lower castes are being invited to feel good that at least they are not Muslim. And conditions are being created for more and more people to feel happy or relieved that at least they are not Muslim. So, but will this work? An invitation is being handed out to these lower castes to join the Hindutva sort of campaign. In return, and there's an implicit return promised of better status, improved status for them. But whether this invitation will be accepted fully, it has been accepted in parts. There have been events and circumstances where it has appeared to be accepted, this invitation, by the lower castes and also by tribals, I have to say. But there have been other instances where it has not been accepted. So it's still an open question. It's not a done deal yet. But this is the question on which I think the future of at least the Indian part of the subcontinent hinges. If the lower castes are genuinely persuaded that they have a better future under Hindutva, in my opinion, that's going to be a major change. That's going to last for a long time. But it hasn't happened yet, and picture abhi baki hai.
Yes. Thank you, Satish. We tackled three of the most burning questions vis-a-vis Indian democracy that we're facing now. And I'd like to bring in Arif because I know he has something to say on this. Arif, please go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I thought I was unmuted. I mean, again, I don't think anybody could put it better than Dr. Deshpande, and I totally agree. And I think Dr. Deshpande has also elsewhere written about how the upper caste converted their caste capital into modern capital under liberalism, and that's how it has perpetuated and maintained their dominance. But again, going back to the question of primacy of religion, and within that framework it is being done right now. I mean, the whole conception of Hindutva, it's basically it goes back to, of course, Savarkar and even before that where this whole idea of bringing people into that umbrella came from. And in a documented way, we can see that when Brahmins started this campaign of getting people to call themselves Hindu, and the first instance we get it in 1909, when the Morlemento reform is brought in for more constitutional provisions and how to give representation to Indians in like local administration and stuff like that. And of course, then the First World War happens, and then it is formalized further and kind of refined further, because now people realize that British Empire can also be defeated and can be at least get into trouble after First World War. And then comes the Montagu-Chelmsford reform, and then they have the separate electorate. And of course, then we have the 1931 census, and which is the only caste census we have had so far. It's been more than 90 years now. And there were active campaigns, not just by Hindu Mahasabha and the groups like Brahminical groups, but also by Muslim League in the 1931 census, to asking people to not to identify themselves by caste, but to identify themselves as Hindus and Muslims in that. And that was very problematic. I'm talking about 1931, a lot of people had trouble putting themselves down as Hindu and Muslims, because these terms did not mean much till that time in their day-to-day lives. I mean, of course, there were like communal violence and stuff like that, instances that were started like that. But outside of, say, major cities and such industrial pockets, there was not much meaning of such an identity. And the caste identity was always kind of always took primacy on that. And this whole bringing together people into this fold is in an ongoing process. I mean, we saw that in US when the black labor got very much together, or the Irish labor got very much together with the black labor and formed very strong unions and started challenging the status quo. Then the Irish were slowly turned white. I mean, and Noel Ignatieff has a great book on it, how the Irish became white. And that bringing into this fold, I mean, of course, race is in many ways similar, but in many ways different than the idea of caste. But this is a constant process, but the hegemonic power almost remains the same, and everybody else is brought under that umbrella. I mean, a little bit earlier, we were talking about professions and how that has changed. So one thing within the Brahminical caste system does not change is the status of the Brahmin or the Brahmins. Everybody can go up and down. Like, for example, Shudras, we have many instances of Shudras becoming Kshatriyas, given the status of Kshatriyas. Most popular on is Shivaji being a Kunbi, and then given the status of Kshatriya, we have the Ahom kings in the northeast. The Ahom kings, basically, they were came from what is modern day China, and they were termed Indravanshi later on, and they were kind of Brahminized, and they became, and of course, many other such groups, people taking up trading, so they are becoming basically Vaishyas, and Shudras owning land, becoming Vaishyas and stuff like that. But it's, I mean, again, I think you wrote in the description that we talk a lot about people who are victims of this system, or who are at the receiving end of the system. We don't talk so much about who are the people who profit from this system, who benefit from this system, who get their privilege from this system. So that remains similar. Like we talk about PSUs or so-called socialist economy or mixed economy in India. It's very clear who are the beneficiaries of that system. We talk about liberalism, and we have seen who are the beneficiaries of system, and it's almost the same people who have been the beneficiaries of the both economic systems. Whereas the people who were the receiving end, okay, you can say that they had little bit, at least in theory, some shot at like moving up or betterment of their condition. But beyond that, there was not much. I mean, even if you look at the data from 80s and 70s of the PSU boards and the senior officials in the PSU, you will almost see the same people who you see today in private sector. I mean, one very good example is actually there is more research on banks, who have been the people who have been the directors and of the banks, PSU banks, and who are the people who are the directors and higher senior officials of private banks. So that, I think, we need to look more at. That remains the same. Thank you.
Thank you, Arif. And Professor Subramanian, can you please comment?
I mean, I agree with everything that Satish and Arif have said. So yes, the market is not cost blind. Yes, neoliberal change has, if anything, reinforced cost differences. The sort of presumption that sedimented or entrenched forms of cost labor would be disrupted through neoliberal transformation. I mean, that has been sort of belied by the actual process of change. Stuart Hall talked about this in terms of, Stuart Hall and many people have talked about this in terms of the importance of ascriptive difference to the organization of capitalism, right? That there are understandings of ascriptive qualities, right? Collective ascriptive qualities that have always been key to the way capitalism conscripts labor, right? So all of this is true, and we're seeing it in the role of the private sector in retrenching cost hierarchies, right? And there's much more sort of open discussion of which social groups are most suited to which forms of labor. I mean, these forms of it's so much more open now, right? To say these things, Brahmins are better at conceptual work, et cetera, et cetera. And I think this is also, we're seeing this everywhere in the world, right? That there's a kind of disaffection with the idea of the state as a really important mechanism of social equalization, right? The state as an important mechanism of redistributive justice, and a return to the market, right, as the only sort of legitimate instrument for organizing both society and economy. And I think all of this is really problematic and doesn't sort of bode well, right, for any kind of emancipatory politics, any kind of politics of equality. But I also, I just want to caution against seeing all of this as somehow predetermined. There's a way in which, we can, in our conversations about the reproduction of inequality, often we sort of fail to attend to the countercurrents, right, that actually make it necessary for elites to adopt new maneuvers to retrench their privilege, right? That there's a kind of dialectics to these historical processes, right? So, why yes, maybe the same groups dominated the PSUs as now dominate private sector corporations, but why is it that elites found the need to regroup in the private sector? It's because there were claims on the public sector that were effective, right? There were claims, and there were movements to challenge entrenched forms of hierarchy that led to, again, new forms of elite maneuver. So I think we really have to think of these as dialectical processes in which the pushback, right, subaltern opposition is as crucial, right, to shaping historical change as it's as crucial as the elite control of resources, right? It's a dynamic between the two things. And often when we're talking about privilege, we lose sight of the highly effective forms of social mobilization that have pushed elites to come up with new forms of political mobilization, like Hindutva politics, right? So, the need to conscript OBCs into the Hindutva fold, the need to make the argument that the only sort of axis of social difference that matters is the religious one. That's an argument, right? That had to be made in the face of OBC mobilization, right? So, and similarly in the US, right? It's not a surprise that Trump followed the Obama presidency. Right? It's not a surprise that, if you go further back, that groups that were seen as inferior races, whether it was the Irish or the Italians, right, after the 1920s became conscripted into the white fold, right? And the only axis of difference that was made to matter, and it had to be made to matter, it wasn't self-evident. The only axis of difference that was made to matter was the one between black and white, or between white and non-white, right? These are strategies, right, that have to be adopted in the face of opposition. I don't want us to lose sight of that, because otherwise, we're failing to give any credit to subaltern politics, right, as being historically consequential.
Yes. Okay. Thank you, Dr. Subramanian. And on that note, I'd like to bring in Dr. Asif from Pakistan, vis-a-vis her views on how state policies and the outlook of the Pakistani state has shaped caste identity in Pakistan. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I think as I mentioned earlier, this has been an ongoing question in Pakistan, but I do also want to emphasize something that I think Dr. Paramsoti mentioned earlier on, which is what happens when caste is invisibilized, right? As it is in Pakistan also, the same way that he pointed out in Sri Lanka. So when you have what amounts to an essentially an invisibilization of caste that comes out only in indirect ways or only comes out at the margins when considering religious minorities, etc. The way that caste has sort of the trajectory it's taken in Pakistan post 47 is very different from the Indian trajectory, because we have not had those kinds of conversations, those kinds of systems that have been in place in India since 1947, right? So we continue to have that conversation about invisibilization and what it means to actually have a state take notice of caste is something at least for the broader population, is to my mind some way off in Pakistan, and where the scheduled category caste categories still exist in Pakistan, or where it's measured, and it is an existing category in bureaucratic in specific bureaucracies that looks like a colonial category, right? It exists because it existed in colonial systems. So that necessary conversation post independence about what it is that the state structures need to do to think about caste has not happened in Pakistan for reasons that I'd gone into earlier. So, and I do think that it's interesting to compare those trajectories, because one of the things that happens and with caste, I think this is something that people have mentioned, is because often caste is a bureaucratic category. If it is not mentioned, if it's a completely invisibilized term of sociality, it winds up very different. It winds up looking very, very different. So I think that's one of the things that having these sort of cross South Asia conversations about this pervasive phenomenon can help highlight.
Thank you, Dr. Asif, for your views. And I'd like to bring in Dr. Paramsoti here. Dr. Paramsoti, can you please shed some light on the
yes, when it comes to the colonial period, there is a interesting studies done by Dirk's invention of caste. How the traditional occupations, it's more or less legitimized when it comes to the occupational setup by colonial rulers. For example, the pariahs, they traditionally did the scavenging work, but then when it comes to the ruling of colonial masters, then they particularly approach that particular caste groups to do the cleaning job. That has happened to the Indian laborers who were brought to plantation sector in Sri Lanka, where they found different caste groups to manage the plantation sector, and laborers from different caste groups. Kind of inventing caste. It's happening in colonial period. But when it comes to the state policy in Sri Lanka, where we don't have a kind of reservation policy that you have in India, because there is an unwritten policy among politicians and policymakers that caste has not been taken to the account of policy formation. Because if we think about caste when it make a policy, then if we give a particular reservation for a particular caste groups, then we more or less legitimize the caste, the hierarchical system. So it's giving a meaning for that. So that's a kind of understanding among Sri Lankan policymakers. So they don't consider caste as the elements when it comes to the policy making. There is no such a policy, but there is an act. It's called Social Disability Act, which was brought in 1960s after Temple and struggle led by left parties and the oppressed caste groups to access the so-called upper caste temples in Sri Lanka. So then there's a common policy like education, free educational policy, which help oppressed caste group to get education up to undergraduate level. So these policies help not particularly focusing on a particular caste group, but general policies, which is inclusive of all caste groups. So the overall understanding of bringing caste as an element in the policy formation is giving more legitimacy to the caste, though they don't want to bring that into the policy. That's a kind of general understanding. Even many academics, when I talk to some academics in Sri Lanka, they say so reservation policy in a way helping caste system rather than annihilation of caste. So that's a kind of understanding that we have. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Paramsoti. And I've just been informed that one of our panelists, Dr. Asif, would have to leave. Please come in for your concluding remarks. Thank you.
Thank you. Apologies. There was a little mix-up in my times. It's 7 p.m. here, so I had a different appointment. But I just wanted to just chime in and sort of build on what I was after what Dr. Paramsoti said, and build what I was saying earlier about invisibilization. One of the things that that conversation, what I should have mentioned, is that those kinds of conversations about invisibilization, and insofar as the state's policies go, do not preclude the maintenance of elite caste privilege, by the state, which happens in Pakistan, and you can see that at the top, where those caste privileges are maintained. There's by those who help form the state. So when we talk about it, one of the things that gets invisibilized is also the way that state structures work to reproduce elite privilege also, which I think what Dr. Deshpande and Dr. Subramaniam was saying about the way that status is one of the stability and the long-term maintenance of status is one of the ways in which caste continues to maintain its hold over our societies today, across even as it changes continuously, it does sort of remain consistent in status. So I just wanted to add that. I'm not sure if I have any concluding remarks other than that, but I apologize very much that I do have to leave at this point. But thank you so much. I learned a great deal from this conversation. Dr. Subramaniam, Dr. Deshpande, Dr. Paramsoti, Arif, and Rachna, and of course Anubhav. Thank you so much for facilitating this. It was really fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Asif, for your presence and for doing this for us. Thank you so much. Learned a great deal from your work and your remarks on the different questions that we had. Thank you so much. Thank you. Rachna, can you please talk about the policies of the state of Nepal towards caste discrimination and what steps it has taken to redress that, and then we'll go ahead and talk about affirmative action policy with other participants. Thank you.
Thank you, Anubhav, for sharing my own mechanism of casteism in Nepal. The fact that Nepal have never been colonized, but we still have been with very cruel regimes like Rana regime, where Dalit people were meant as a third citizen of the country, and they were not accessing their rights. And later on, after the restoration of the democracy in 1992, which is a great move of the country, where it has written slogans, the rights of the Dalit, and from 1962 in Nepal, the constitutional rights was restored, and it says the caste-based discriminations are punishable and it's illegal in Nepal and it can be punished. And later on, the Constitution of Nepal in 2015 endorsing the rights and opportunities for Dalit people for uplifting their rights and providing them opportunities, and also it has provided the reservations quota system for providing rights for Dalit for upliftment of their social well-being. And in 2017, National Dalit Commission Act was formed, which enacted to ensure the rights of people, Dalit people in Nepal. And if I would say, like the first public movement which established the democratic system in Nepal, and it has played a great role. And Dalit people have played a very important role in the Maoist arms conflict in Nepal for 10 years, and they have given their really important contribution for fighting this social injustice for caste discriminations. And this is the time of the period for 10 years we could see the changes which could be vividly seen and measured, that many Maoist armed force together with those Dalit people's involvement, they were like destroying the temples and even giving some consequences to the priest, to religious leaders who were misleading the society and who were discriminating to Dalit community with the power of their God's words. And then after the movement, after the civil war in Nepal, Dalit people are started raising their voices, and many organizations like private partnership, like NGOs, INGOs, have started working together with government, and then they started providing scholarships and quota systems, and that's how like Dalit movements rose, and the Dalit Commission Act was established, and these days we could see the freedom of speech, and Dalit people would ask for their rights if they feel being dominated or discriminated in the public area or even in their private properties. If somebody says you were Dalit, you were not allowed to touch, and you were untouchable or impure, and they would actually get access of their rights, going to the police and filing their cases, and also like getting the rights. But still, we do have really best constitutional rights and all the laws and provisions. But I would say that there hasn't been enough or sufficient implementation of those laws, which are only lies on the statement in our constitutions, but in real life, in a real society, it exists. And there has to be a lot of input and effort putting in to make the aware of people, and also uplifting the Dalits for raising their voices up and for accessing their rights. And later on in 2011, the Crime Elimination and Punishment Act was launched. So in this launch, if somebody discriminates based on the caste, color, or religions, um, it would be illegal, and it is punishable. So people get their access of rights. So after the second post public movement in Nepal, uh, which has restored the structure and framework, and also it has provided 13% of reservation in the representation families in the assembly. So it is actually providing the fewer rights of the Dalit, and this is a positive change. And I really believe that the things are changing, and the situation about caste discrimination is not similarly as in 19th century. So things have been changing, and I'm very optimistic and I'm hopeful here speaking while I speak. There would be positive changes in over the time, and when people like us, we talk, we educate people, and then we reform our policies, because policies are meant to provide the rights of people, and it is changeable. Like all the social like rituals, norms, or practices are changeable, because if we look in back in the time, there was in Nepal, there was sati system, sati partha, which means if the husband dies, the wife has to go and kill herself immediately, because she was not allowed to live. So the sati partha was taking the rights of women, because if their life span was in the hand of the husband, if husband dies in such a young age, then wife was meant to die in the same day in the funeral. But this practice no longer exists. It was also the social practice, which was
Yes.
harmful, which was against of the human rights, and it was abandoning women for living, and even their lives decisions was in the man's hand. But now no more sati parthas. That has been completely changed. So I truly believe that casteism is also changeable, and without economical justice, the social justice is not possible, I would say. From my
Thank you,
point
Rashna.
of view, you're
Yeah. Oh,
welcome.
please give your concluding remarks, because we have Dr. Paramsoti who would like to come in. So can we move
Okay.
on?
So yeah, I would be so quick, because in this federal government system, from last past years of the experience, that Dalit people are being elected, and like they are taking their involvement in the politics, and but I would say if they are economically empowered, and then they are like really confident about being elected. And even in last five years, one Dalit um, uh, won the election, and he was the local president of the ward. And I would only see the strength in him because he was economically empowered, and he was economically what I say. So I see the economical development is the most important to let them to get their social justice. So yeah, we have to provide economical opportunities for Dalit people, giving them income opportunities, and this is how we gonna manage or balance the social life and well-being of people. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rashna. Dr. Paramsoti, can you please come in, and then we'll take your concluding remarks, and then we'll open up this discussion for questions.
Thank you. Thank all the panelists, Ajendra, Sadiq, Saraf, Rachna, and Asi for it was all great listening to you all, and the panelists who managed to organize this event. I just want to finally say a few words about based on the last question you formed about how academia really successful in capturing an essential caste as a lived reality of millions of people in South Asia. But what I see actually when I did my field work in Sri Lanka, I see what we do as a field work and collect the data from people and by living with them. As soon as we left the field, then we have as a kind of discontinuity, the disconnect and connection. They don't know what is going to happen to the data that the information or the story they shared with us. So that's a very 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 big gap between the researcher and the and then the participants. So based on that reality, I feel that it's very important to bringing our understanding and reality into a normal words, or bringing that understanding to the people as well. So based on that understanding, it's always better to produce some visual project like documentary film, this that, or taking their taking interview from people and digitalizing them and bringing that to a discussion within the community. That was very useful. So because of that reason, I managed to produce a documentary film based on my field work. So that will help having the continuous interaction between the researcher and the participants. So when it comes to it's capturing the essence of caste as a lived reality for the millions of people. Of course, it's a very vast question, and we can't say how, we can't judge even how that helpful. How what can we give back? So we can say no, we can say yes. So with that note, thanks for everything, and thanks for all the panelists and the participants and all the organizers, and thanks for inviting me as well. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Again, I'd like to now open up this discussion for our participants, for the audience. And please, if you have any questions for our panelists, please go ahead. Okay, I had one question, and I think I'll go ahead with this since for now there is no question from the audience. And it really is about the affirmative action policy in India. How useful has this affirmative action policy been as far as its end goal of ending or limiting caste discrimination through representation is concerned? I mean, is it that it has taken away the focus from the critical examination of the privilege that it accords to upper castes? I mean, in that sense, what has been its impact on the politics of caste? Has it limited its scope as far as social justice is concerned, to only safeguarding reservations rather than focusing on the annihilation of caste, or for asking say reparations to hold upper castes accountable? And is this a model that can actually be replicated across the subcontinent to achieve equity? And Professor Subramanian, I'd like to start with you, given your recent work about caste and merit. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Anubhav. I mean, look, it's quite clear that affirmative action has been hugely consequential for changing the social composition of higher educational institutions and of the white collar professions. I mean, Tamil Nadu is a really good instance of this, right? So, and as Satish pointed out, caste is not reducible to class, and as such, it has to be an independent basis for legislating rights. And affirmative action is one example of how this has happened. But it's not sufficient. It's both necessary and not sufficient for addressing enduring forms of inequality, right? Both economic and social. And in part, this is because it's not really a policy of, it's not as far-reaching a policy of economic redistribution because of how delimited it is by its spheres of application. And this is all the more so when you consider that the private sector is the most rapidly expanding sector of the Indian economy. and affirmative action does not apply to the private sector, right? So it's even if it had a more far-reaching impact, at an earlier moment, its impact is being reduced systematically, right? So I don't think it's sufficient. I mean, the other thing I'll say is that, in some ways and again, I think Tamil Nadu is a really important sort of case of this. In some ways, it has redirected the focus of caste rights politics to arenas that have been traditionally monopolized by the upper castes, right? And it has largely left in place a kind of a larger structure of a larger kind of hierarchy of value, right? Where, certain occupations are still seen as low status, as undesirable, right? So there's a mad rush to gain access to only those professions that are seen as high status, right? So it hasn't helped to address that more sort of fundamental question, right, of the hierarchies of labor and value. Those are still in place. Those still have to be addressed. The other thing I don't think it has done, I mean, I think like electoral politics, affirmative action has been really consequential for just a kind of common sense perception of caste, right? So these categories of the general and the reserved have become consolidated caste categories, right? People have started to identify on these grounds, and the reserved as a category in some ways has become a new basis for stigmatization, and we see this in the experiences of students who come in through reservations, and this is more so in institutions, the most sort of elite strata of institutions like the IITs, right? Where they sort of experience stigmatization as reserved category students, right? So this is a problem, and I think this is a problem that is in part related to something that Satish has written about really powerfully, which is the invisibilization of caste when it comes to the makeup of the general category, right? That caste is only visible on one side of the boundary and not the other. And so it seems to be a sort of illegitimate basis for access and opportunity, right? And I think the only way to sort of correct for that is to make it much more visible, right? On the other side of the equation, right? To force people to recognize that that the general category is itself rooted in forms of caste privilege, right? And so I think in all of these ways, affirmative action is both necessary and inadequate as a kind of basis for a more wholesale transformation of social and economic hierarchies. There also needs to be a lot more political work done to illuminate the caste bases of social privilege, right? There needs to be much more work done, and I think that the scholarship is definitely tending in that direction. Scholarship on caste is no longer just scholarship on lower caste, which was the case for a very long time. But I think there needs to be a lot more work done on that.
Thank you, Dr. Subramanian. Dr. Deshpande, if you'd like to come in, please, on this. And then we have a question from Richard that we'd address and move on.
Right. Reservations. I'm sorry to. I don't mean. I've been talking on this topic for nearly 30 years now, so it feels very. Let me just put it down in point form. There are a lot of problems with the way that reservation as a word, as an idea, and as a policy is received in the popular imagination. So to start with, first, we have failed, we meaning intellectuals, activists, all those concerned with such questions. We have failed spectacularly to establish the primary meaning of the original reservation as a political reservation. That was one of the cornerstones of, it was the very foundation of the nation itself. If we had not had the original reservation policy, which flowed out of the Pune Pact and the 1935 Government of India Act, we would not have had the nation of India formed as we recognize it today. So our problem, one of the biggest problems with reservation is that that word has, in a sense, occupied the original idea. So later models or later conceptions of reservation have been based on completely different ideas of backwardness or deprivation of some kind, ideas about welfare programs, and so on. And the same word and the same policy framework has been used for such programs as well. And this has been extremely bad because it has made us lose sight of the original program, which had nothing to do with backwardness, which had nothing to do with deprivation or nothing to do with welfare. It was about it was the forced inclusion of those who were forcibly excluded from our society. So because we forget this, reservation becomes almost a millstone, it becomes a liability because it sucks up so much of the attention and so much of the discursive space on questions of caste inequality. And narrowly conceived, reservation as it is most popularly understood as a kind of welfare program or as a kind of handout is completely unable to address the huge problem of caste inequality and caste oppression. Whereas it is seen as in the mainstream upper caste imagination, since Nehruvian time, it is seen as the answer to caste inequality. It is seen as having settled the caste question, whereas it has done nothing but do that. So another major disservice it does to the discourse on caste is that it allows for a dominant common sense of reservation as an exception and meritocracy as the rule. As though outside of the quotas and outside of reservation, all competition is fair and equitable and so on, which is never the case. So for all these reasons, I think, despite, of course, there's no question, as a policy, it has had an enormous impact, and our country would have looked very different if we had not had a reservation policy. But having said all that, at the ideological level, especially in the post-90s discourse, it has also had these major drawbacks. And the final nail in that coffin of this ideological idea of reservation is the EWS reservation, which makes a whole mockery of the whole idea of reservation by turning it into a sort of a handout that anybody who can twist the arm of the state has the right to get it. And all the various other demands, Jat reservations, Patidar reservation, etc., etc. There are many such cases. So because of this, the word reservation sucks up all the space for discussion on this, and this repeatedly happens whenever there's a meeting organized on caste. The first or the second question from the audience is about reservation, and then we argue endlessly after that on reservations, and the larger issue of caste inequality gets forgotten, including, of course, the important points that Ajanta was mentioning. Caste privilege never figures in this because it is assumed that outside of reservation, caste is not operating in the distribution of resources, or whereas it's even more, caste is even more important outside the reserved categories than it is for the reserved categories. But we could not have done without this policy.
Thank you so much, Professor Deshpande. I think Arif has something to say, and then we'll address the question and sum it up. Arif, please go.
Thank you, Anubhav. And I'll have to drop off after my remarks. Sorry, I kind of have to be somewhere else. So yeah, I mean, in the sense that I totally agree with what Ajanta and what Dr. Subramanian and Dr. Deshpande said about this. And we also need to look at kind of bring it a little bit narrower of what Dr. Deshpande was saying, that what has happened to this affirmative action. This affirmative action was funded totally by the state, in the state institutions. I mean, we have the political representation in jobs and in education. So one thing which they don't talk so much about or no objections about is political representation, because that is, of course, only for Dalits, and they have kind of tamed it. They tamed the system because of the first past the post electoral system we have. And Kanchinam actually wrote a book about it back in '82, Chamcha Yug. The age of the sycophants, that how these people who get elected on Dalit quota, how they are not able to do anything against caste, because they are actually at the mercy of the dominant caste because the way the electoral system is set up. Coming to the education and jobs, I mean, since there were obvious obstructions and obstacles before, but since liberalization, we have seen the withdrawal of state from these sectors. And of course, in private sector, there is no affirmative action, at least I'm not aware of. And so there the pie is shrinking anyways. And I think it's a big sort of drawback or weakness of the groups who proclaim that they're there for social justice, that they never kind of put out their, beyond the 60s and 70s, a very socialist, a very kind of Indian socialist way. They could not never put forward this argument, or they could not develop a proper economic vision. Like, for example, we talk about groups like RJD, Rashtriya Janata Dal in Bihar, or Samajwadi Party in UP, or even DMK in Tamil Nadu. The alternative economic vision is totally missing. Ultimately, they all fall into the basket of neoliberalism. I mean, DMK could be all progressive in terms of social issues and stuff like that, and 70% affirmative action quota. But where is your alternative economic vision? Okay, and without that alternative economic vision, how you think that you're going to address this very pernicious, entrenched social issue, which again, you need also a social vision to do that. And lack of economic vision, lack of social vision, and we saw that lack of social vision, what that did to the movements of social justice at least in North India, because these parties who came, the groupings which came in the name of social justice, they did not have an alternative social vision, and they did not have an egalitarian worldview. And that's why we say, like in Bihar, they kind of cut out the Brahminical forces, cut out the extremely backward caste or Mahadalit out of that formation. And that's how they tripped the whole kind of movement, or the parties who claim to act on social justice. We saw in UP that how they carved out non-Yadavs and non-Jatavs out of that formation, because actually there was that kind of domination by these particular groups in administration, in governance once they took over, because there was a lack of a social vision that we need to reach the last person in the hierarchy. I mean, the middle and upper OBCs, they managed to get power. So I think affirmative action, as Dr. Subramanian was also saying, that it's necessary, but of course not sufficient that way. But going beyond that, the people, the groups, they claim to represent these interests and work towards annihilation of caste, works towards a more equitable society. They have totally failed in formation and development of an alternative vision, an alternative economic vision, an alternative social vision, and an alternative political vision as well. I mean, okay. Thank you very much. Thank you to the organizers, Anubhav, everybody who joined. I have to drop off. My apologies that I stayed for this very interesting discussion. Thank you all.
Thank you, Arif. I think Dr. Subramanian also has to leave. Please come in for your concluding remarks. Please go ahead.
I don't know if I have any concluding remarks. I mean, I think this was a really, really productive conversation. I think we really need to have more of these conversations across that, that are not dominated by discussions on caste in India. So I'm really grateful to have heard from Rachna and Ghazal and Tangesh. So thank you so much for organizing this, Anubhav. It was a great conversation, and I'd love to continue it in some capacity.
Yes.
If we can have a part 2, you can count me in.
Sure. Thank you so much, Dr. Subramanian, for your comments and your presence and for doing this for us. Thank you very much. I think there is one question for Rachna, I believe that is. Rachna, do you think that you talked about a Dalit being elected as a ward chair in Nepal? So someone is, and the point is that it was based on funds from local workers in the Gulf. So do you see this as an anomaly, or do you see this as a positive development that is likely to continue? We have another question. Please go ahead after this, and we'll conclude the discussion. Thank you so much.
Okay, I take this example as a positive aspect of when Dalit people have economical standard, as they can get votes and they can go in the decision-making positions. So I wonder if he wouldn't have that much of funds and economical empower, then maybe he could possibly not get the tickets or not be elected and not to get his rights of in politics. So I take it as a positive change that we have to uplift the as a whole Dalit community, and they have to have their access of their rights, and if they are economically secured, and if they have power and they can go to the positions in decision making. So yeah.
Thank you so much, Rachna. I think Wangchuk has something to say about caste system in
In affirmative changes.
Sorry.
Reservation in quota system in Nepal.
Yeah, I think Wangchuk was here. He wanted to say something because we are kind of running short of time. Wangchuk, if you're there, can you please quickly put forth your point, sorry.
So do you want me to continue with the quota system in Nepal?
Very quickly, Rachna, if you could just shed 1 or 2 points so that we could sum this up. I think we are running short of time. We're sorry to say. I mean, as so often happens with conversations like these. So please go ahead, Rachna. A quick remark from you about the quota system in Nepal, the reservation policy in Nepal, and then we would sum this up. Please go ahead. Rachna, please go ahead. A quick remark. I think you're muted. A quick remark or two about Nepal's affirmative action policy, please.
Yes, I would say like from the government side, providing quota system and reservation systems is being positive, and it also gives the affirmations to Dalit people to utilize their quota system. But as you go in the public and as you see the view of the youngster these days, they don't see it as positive because they go against of the quota system, and they take quota system is making Dalit people to be more vulnerable, and it's like it's never going to be the same, and they will never get the equal rights, and it's never going to be the same again. So they take as a battle, and if Dalit people ask for quota system, and it simply is like holding the license to be dominated and discriminated by the society, and they say so many bad comments in social media. If we go like, how do you ask quotas and how do you fight for reservation if you feel like you are equally capable why don't you like go and fight in independently, because you were not able, so you were still the lowest, you are still the unfit or disqualified, and how come you dream to come to the position or get all the reservation? So for me, if I see from the point of youth, these days, the quota system is really making the hot debate in Nepal, and many of the people from so-called upper caste, they would go completely against of this quota system, and they say like it has to be end, it has to be finished. But if we see some Dalit activists and Dalit rights activists, and they would still like protest about it has to be continue, and the government should provide the equal reservation and quota to Dalit students by providing scholarship or building Dalit hostel. So if imagine there is a hostel built for only Dalit girls and boys, so they are just being, society to look them as a Dalit and start discriminating you because you are in the Dalit hostel, and they would even before asking your name and surname, they would understand that you belong to Dalit and you were staying in the Dalit hostel, and they will start dominating you. So from my point of view,
Thank you, everyone who came here today and participated in this discussion, particularly our panelists. Satish for staying with us throughout. Dr. Subramanian was here, Arif was here, Dr. Paramsoti was here, Dr. Ghazal was here, and of course, Rachna also for staying with us to the very end. And all, everyone in the audience who's, thank you for all of your patience. And I think this conversation has been particularly helpful as far as capturing the diversity of this concept of caste is concerned, and how, some of the questions that caste poses, if they can be answered, in what way they can be answered. At present, we may not have any sure answers, but I think what we've really been able to capture through Rachna has been the lived reality of caste, particularly in Nepal, which often gets sidelined when one starts to talk of caste and caste-based discrimination, because considering the size of India and the course that Dalit politics has taken, we often tend to lose track of how the institution of caste tends to work across regions other than in India. And for that, I'm very grateful for Rachna's comments and everyone else for inviting her. I'm also very grateful for Sambal, for organizing this, for all the hard work that she put in, contacting panelists and keeping in touch with me about anything and everything that I needed. Thank you so much, Sambal. I know it's been hard work for you. I'm really grateful for all the hard work that you've put in. Thank you very much. And I also thank SARIM for constantly taking an initiative to talk about caste-based discrimination in South Asia. I think it's one of the very few platforms that I've come across which has taken such a keen interest and has constantly, upheld this interest as far as both, the viewers, the audience, and as far as also the intellectuals and activists are concerned. So thank you, Sarim, for this opportunity, for giving us this opportunity to everyone. Sambal, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for such an invigorating discussion. It was very insightful, and I hope everyone learned as much as I did. And it was really interesting. And also, the discussion opened up new avenues for more discussion, as Dr. Ajanta suggested. So I hope today's discussion would contribute in a constructive manner towards anti-caste struggle. And thank you, Anubhav, for moderating in such a well manner. And you have really put in great effort for this, which I'm in debt of for you. So last but not least, I would like to thank my team at SARIM here, who have done all the efforts behind the curtains, which include our IT in charge, Najibuddin, our researcher, Saika Lakho, Heman Das, Rimsha Shahid and Furko Isarbhil. And again, thank you for all the panelists to contribute with their insightful discussion and their research or from their experiences. We are very thankful, and also to the audience who have joined in. This is from our side, and we'll come with more such discussions in the future.